Okay, let's just dive right into this explainer. If you follow global events at all, you already know that energy is basically at the center of almost every major conflict. But today we're unpacking a truly fascinating shift in global power dynamics. Specifically, we're looking at how the United States transformed into the world's undisputed top oil producer, and how that single fact has completely rewired the entire world over the last decade. It's a massive ripple effect.
Here's our roadmap for today. First, the new oil reality. Second, big oil versus OPEC. Third, weaponizing global energy. Fourth, the energy independence myth. And finally, reading the oil markets. All right, let's kick things off with Section 1, the new oil reality.
So, to really understand the current energy crisis, we have to establish a baseline of who actually controls production today. Thanks to the massive shale boom of the 2010s and some wild new drilling technologies, the US literally doubled its share of global production. They now sit firmly in the #1 spot at roughly 15%. That beats out traditional heavyweights like Saudi Arabia and Russia, who are both sitting around 13%. Think about that. Just a few decades ago, the US was heavily dependent on imports, and today, they're the single most influential producer on Earth.
Now, this massive increase in domestic production ties directly into what's known as the petrodollar system. For a century, the global practice of pricing and trading oil primarily in US dollars has granted America immense economic leverage. And rising US domestic production, well, that's essentially become a crucial new pillar for this entire system, anchoring it even as other nations try their hardest to challenge its dominance. And the result of all that? Well, despite countries like Iran demanding payments in alternative currencies, like the Chinese yuan, an overwhelming 80% of global oil sales are still conducted in US dollars. The petrodollar system is just deeply, deeply entrenched.
Okay, moving right along to Section 2, big oil versus OPEC. History gives us a really fascinating shift in power here. Back in the early 20th century, Western corporate cartels, often called the Seven Sisters, had an absolute iron grip on the global market. But jump to 1960 and the script completely flipped with the rise of state-owned coalitions. And that leads us right up to modern geopolitical chess moves, like the US shale boom and the recent super dramatic withdrawal of the United Arab Emirates from OPEC.
Now, to really grasp that timeline, we have to talk about what OPEC actually is. Formed during the peak of anti-colonial movements back in 1960, OPEC gave Global South producers a way to coordinate policies, secure fair prices, and push back against Western corporate dominance. These were state-owned companies, right? They were designed to use oil revenues to fund national development and public programs rather than just funneling money into the pockets of Western corporations. Which brings us to the present day. The UAE is a massive producer, generating roughly 3 million barrels a day, so their recent withdrawal from OPEC is a huge deal. The source analysis views this US-backed exit as a highly calculated move to destabilize the bloc. By weakening OPEC's collective bargaining power, the leverage shifts right back toward Western supermajors, allowing them to maximize their own market influence. It's a major geopolitical victory for the US. Let's jump to Section 3, weaponizing global energy.
The stakes for market control are absolutely incredibly high. Get this. Before recent conflicts disrupted the flow, a staggering 20% of all globally traded oil passed daily through the incredibly narrow Strait of Hormuz, right off the coast of Iran. Being able to control or entirely shut down a physical choke point like that, it serves as a massive geopolitical deterrent.
But, a physical choke point isn't the only weapon on the board. Both the US and competing nations actively use energy access to force outcomes. We saw the intentional crashing of global oil prices back in 2014 to pressure Venezuela and Russia. We see economic blockades cutting off countries like Cuba and Iran from fuel, right alongside the rewarding of strategic alliances, like the US praising the UAE's OPEC exit. The takeaway here is pretty simple. Energy markets aren't just business. They are deeply, fundamentally political.
All right, let's get into Section 4, the energy independence myth. You hear this political talking point absolutely everywhere, energy independence. But we have to ask, is the US truly independent? Well, while America has technically been a net exporter of refined petroleum products since 2020, if you look at the raw materials required to actually keep the country running, it reveals a much, much more complicated reality. Just think about this staggering number. Despite producing more oil than anyone else on Earth, the US still imports 6.28 million barrels of crude oil every single day. 6.28 million. How is that even possible? The answer actually comes down to chemistry. It turns out not all oil is the same. The US primarily produces what's called light sweet crude. It has low viscosity, low sulfur, and is absolutely perfect for making gasoline. But a modern economy needs a mix. Heavy industry, machinery, making asphalt. That all requires heavy sour crude, which is thick and high in sulfur. So the US has plenty of the light stuff, but it desperately needs the heavy stuff to keep its economy operating profitably. And because of this chemical mismatch, the US is permanently tethered to the global market.
They import a massive 52% of this required heavy crude from Canada and another 11% from Mexico. And notice, they still retain a crucial 5% reliance on Saudi Arabia. The global market is just entirely interconnected. And honestly, this is exactly why absolute energy independence is a total myth. The physical machinery of the U.S. energy sector, these massive, highly specialized, hungry refinery machines called cokers, located mostly down in the Gulf of Mexico, they were designed decades ago, and they were built specifically to process heavy crude from places like Mexico and Venezuela. The U.S. energy sector was literally built from the ground up for global interdependence.
Finally, let's look at Section 5, reading the oil markets.
Because not all oil is equal chemically, it isn't priced equally either. The global benchmarks reflect this reality perfectly. Brent and West Texas Intermediate, or WTI, are light, sweet crudes. They're super easy to refine and high in demand, so they naturally trade at a premium. The Urals benchmark from Russia, on the other hand, is heavy, sour, much harder to process, and heavily sanctioned by the West. Therefore, it trades at a discount. So prices are really just chemistry and geopolitics combined.
Now, to understand where a global crisis is actually headed, the source analysis tells us you have to look away from spot prices, which is just the price of oil right this very second. Instead, you need to focus on futures contracts. These are financial agreements to buy or sell oil at a set price at a specific time in the future. They're used heavily by investors in industries like airlines to hedge against sudden risk.
So, when analyzing a recent major geopolitical shock, near-term June futures spiked to around $140 a barrel. That indicates severe immediate disruption. But consider December futures. They traded much lower, around $80. What does that tell us? Well, it tells us investors expect the immediate price shock to soften by year's end, as supply chain issues get somewhat resolved. But crucially, those prices are not expected to drop all the way back down to the pre-war baseline of $60 to $70. The disruption has lasting power. And all of this leads to a pretty stark warning from groups like Oxford Economics. Because the oil market is entirely global, a sustained energy crisis doesn't just hurt you at the gas pump. It directly threatens global food supplies, because agriculture relies heavily on oil for fertilizers and transport. This puts massive upward pressure on inflation and threatens the standard of living everywhere.
We've seen how the U.S. shale boom changed the game, how oil is routinely weaponized, and exactly why absolute independence is an illusion. As the ripple effects of these complex maneuvers continue to wash over the world, we're left with one massive unknown to ponder. If the futures market is right, how much economic damage will everyday consumers sustain before this global geopolitical chessboard finally settles? Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer. Keep asking questions, and I'll see you next time.